Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are wading into some truly turbulent waters. We're looking at a figure who is quite possibly the most contradictory character we've ever profiled.
Oh, absolutely.
Imagine a man who is an absolute national icon, yet he spent a huge portion of his life, loathing the very society he lived in.
It's a study in friction, isn't it? We're talking about someone born into the Australian aristocracy, a wealthy grazier's son who ends up becoming, a radical left-wing activist.
And not just any activist. This is the only Australian to ever win the Nobel Prize in literature.
Exactly. And when he wins it, his reaction isn't joy or pride. He describes the experience as a terrifying and destructive experience.
Who says that? It's incredible. We are, of course, talking about Patrick White, and the mission for this deep dive is to really unpack the life of this man. We want to understand how he wrote these massive visionary stories about individuals clashing with what he called a materialistic conformist society.
And, how his own personal isolation, his own feeling of being an outsider, actually fueled a literary revolution in Australia.
To do that, we have a really rich stack of sources. We're looking at his biography, critical reception of his work, which, as we'll see, was often just brutal.
Unbelievably so.
We've got specific analyses of his novels, like Voss and The Tree of Man, his personal letters, which are fascinating, and the detailed records of his political evolution.
So it's a pretty comprehensive picture we're trying to build.
Right. So before we get into the weeds of his life, let's address the big so what question. Why does Patrick White matter to someone listening today who might not be a huge literature buff?
I think it matters because White fundamentally changed the landscape of Australian storytelling. Before him, the prevailing style was this very dry, dun-colored realism, as it was called.
What does that mean, dun-colored?
It means kind of drab, brown, factual. It was all about the bush, the hardship, the external reality, describing the flies and the heat. White came along and brought high modernism to the outback. He challenged the idea that Australian stories had to be simple or purely descriptive.
So he was saying there's more going on here than just sheep and dust.
Exactly. He wanted to show that the Australian landscape, and more importantly, the Australian soul, was capable of immense, complex spiritual drama. He wanted to write about the inner world.
He essentially forced the culture to grow up whether it wanted to or not, which it seems it mostly did not want to do.
It kicked and screamed the whole way.
Okay. So to understand the man, we have to start with the boy. And honestly, his start in life sounds like something out of a Dickens novel or maybe a Henry James novel.
It really does. So he's born in 1912, but the first complication is he's not born in Australia. He's born in Knightsbridge, London.
Right in the heart of the empire.
His parents, Victor and Ruth, were these incredibly wealthy Australians from a pastoralist dynasty. They were on what was basically an extended honeymoon that lasted for years. They only moved back to Sydney when Patrick was about 6 months old. So that initial displacement, that sense of not quite belonging in either place, it sort of set the tone for his entire life.
And he wasn't exactly a rough-and-tumble bush kid, was he?
Oh, God, no. Far from it. He was an incredibly fragile child. At 4 years old, he developed severe asthma. And this is a really crucial detail.
Why? I mean, lots of kids have asthma.
Well, back then, in the early 20th century, a serially sick child was often kept apart. There was a fear of, infection or just the general fragility. So he lived in a flat with his sister, a nanny, and a maid, while his parents lived in an adjoining flat.
Wait, in a separate flat? As a toddler?
Yes. A profound level of separation. He spent a huge amount of time alone, and you can see how that would foster a rich inner life, a powerful imagination.
He had to create his own world.
He had to. He fell in love with the theater early on. His mother would take him to pantomimes. But his real emotional connection, interestingly, wasn't with his parents. It was with his nurse, a woman named Lizzie Clark.
I love that detail from the files, that she was the one who taught him to always tell the truth and not blow his own trumpet.
It's wonderfully ironic, isn't it? The man who would become this world-famous author, this towering figure, being told not to be boastful.
And it seems like a part of him really took that to heart, that wariness of fame.
It stayed with him his whole life. But the real trauma, and I don't think that's too strong a word, came when he was 13. His parents did what wealthy colonial families did back then. They shipped him off to an English public school.
Cheltenham College in Gloucestershire. Sounds very fancy.
It sounds fancy, but White had a different name for it. He called it an expensive prison.
An expensive prison. That says everything.
He absolutely hated it. You have to try and put yourself in his shoes. He's this colonial boy in a very rigid, class-obsessed British system. He's immediately an outsider. He gets mocked for his Australian accent.
On top of that, he's dealing with his health, the asthma.
And crucially, he was already certain of his own homosexuality. So imagine it. You're a teenager in the 1920s in this sadistic, puritanical, hyper-masculine boarding school environment, and you're hiding your sexuality, you're being mocked for your background, and you can't breathe properly.
The sense of alienation must have been absolute.
It was. The sources say he never forgave his mother for sending him there. That's a heavy, heavy burden to carry through life. It completely solidified the sense of being an alien. He wasn't fully Australian because he was in England, but he was never going to be English because he was Australian, and he wasn't one of the boys because of his artistic nature and his sexuality.
So he just withdrew into himself.
Completely. Into books, into his own head. But he did have an escape plan, right?
Yeah.
He had this dream of being an actor.
He did. He pleaded with his parents to let him leave school early to go on the stage.
And they being, very practical, wealthy landowners, were horrified by this, an actor. In their family, they wanted him to run a sheep station.
So they struck a compromise.
A very Australian compromise. He could leave school early without his final exams, but only if he went back to Australia to try life on the land.
The classic go jackarooing and toughen up strategy. See if they can knock the artistic nonsense out of him.
Precisely. So in 1929, he returns to New South Wales. He works as a jackaroo in the Monaro district and then at Walgett, out in the middle of nowhere. And this is where the contradiction just deepens.
How do you mean?
Well, physically, he was completely unsuited for it. His asthma was a constant issue. His temperament was all wrong. He wasn't a grazier. In fact, his uncle actually wrote to his parents and said, flat out, this boy is not suited for the land.
The experiment failed.
The experiment failed. But, and this is the crucial but, the landscape itself seared itself into his brain. He may have hated the work, the sheer physical labor, but the starkness of the Australian bush, the quality of the light, the silence, the colors, it all planted the seeds for his future descriptions.
So he was failing as a farmer, but he was gathering the raw material he would need to write The Tree of Man and Voss.
Exactly. He was absorbing the very essence of the place, even as he was rejecting the life that was expected of him there.
Okay, so the sheep station experiment is officially a bust. What's next? His parents must be at their wits' end.
His mother, Ruth, still had ambitions for him. If not a grazier, then perhaps a diplomat. Something respectable. So the next step was Cambridge. He goes to King's College in 1932 to study French and German literature.
That must have been a monumental shift for him, from the dust and isolation of Walgett to the ancient halls of Cambridge.
Massive. This is where he finally finds his intellectual home. He discovers the heavy hitters of modernism. He's reading Proust, Thomas Mann, James Joyce, Gertrude Stein. He's traveling to France and Germany. He's finally realizing that literature can be more than just a simple story.
It can be an exploration of consciousness itself.
Precisely. That you can map the internal world just as you can map a continent.
He also published a collection of poetry around this time, didn't he? The Plowman.
He did in 1935. And this is classic Patrick White.
No.
He later grew to hate it so much that he tried to suppress it. He literally went around buying up secondhand copies so he could burn them.
Wow. He was always his own harshest critic, wasn't he?
From the very beginning. But Cambridge gave him the intellectual foundation and the confidence he needed. It validated his artistic impulses.
Okay, let's move into the 1930s. He's graduated. Instead of becoming a diplomat, which I'm sure his mother was still hoping for, he decides to become a writer in London. And he's not exactly a starving artist in a garret.
Not at all. His father gave him a very generous allowance, £400 a year, which was a lot of money then, and later he inherited a legacy of £10,000. So he had the freedom to write without worrying about paying the rent. He was living in London's Pimlico district, mixing with artists and writers.
And this is where he meets a really pivotal figure, Roy de Maistre.
Yes, the Australian painter. This relationship was absolutely crucial. De Maistre was a lover for a time, but more importantly, he became a mentor, an artistic guide.
He taught White to see things differently.
He taught him to write from the inside out.
What does that mean exactly, from the inside out? It sounds a bit abstract.
Well, it means moving away from pure naturalism. Just describing what a chair looks like or what a house looks like. It means trying to describe how the chair feels to the person sitting in it or how the house feels to the person looking at it. It's about projecting the internal psychological state of your characters onto the external world. The landscape reflects the soul.
So the weather isn't just weather, it's a state of mind.
That's it, exactly. And that becomes the absolute signature style of Patrick White.
But then, as happened to so many people of his generation, history intervenes in a big way. World War II breaks out.
Right. The bohemian life in London comes to an abrupt end. White joins the Royal Air Force as an intelligence officer. He's posted to North Africa, the Middle East.
And this leads us to what is arguably the single most important meeting of his entire life.
Without a doubt. Alexandria, Egypt, 1941. It's the middle of the war, everything is uncertain, and White meets a Greek army recruit named Manoly Lascaris.
And this wasn't just a wartime fling, this was something else entirely.
This was it. This was the defining relationship of his life. White's own words for it are just so beautiful and so precise. He described Manoly as the central mandala in my life's hitherto messy design.
Wow. The central mandala. That's so much more than just saying, my soulmate.
It is. A mandala is a symbol of wholeness, of order, of a spiritual center. It suggests that before Manoly, White felt his life was scattered, chaotic, without a core. Manoly provided that center.
And they remain partners for the rest of their lives.
For nearly 50 years. But here's a twist. The war ends. White has a choice. He can stay in London, where the literary culture is, where his publisher is, or he can go back to Australia.
And you would think, given how much he struggled with Australia later on, that he would have jumped at the chance to stay in London.
He was tempted, but he also had this great fear of becoming what he called that most sterile of beings, a London intellectual. He was afraid he would dry up, become too cynical, too detached from real life.
But he was still terrified of going back to Australia.
Absolutely. He associated it with his prison years, with failure. It was actually Manoly, the Greek who had never even been there, who pushed for it. He wanted to start a new life somewhere new.
That is fascinating. The Greek partner is the one who wants to go to the Australian bush.
White wrote that he ultimately relented because it was Manoly's illusion, and he sensed that Manoly's illusion was a better, healthier thing than his own jaded reality. So, in 1948, they packed their bags and returned.
And they don't move to a trendy inner-city suburb. They buy a farm.
Dogwoods. They bought a small farm at Castle Hill, which back then was on the semi-rural fringe of Sydney.
I just love the image of this. You have Patrick White, this Cambridge-educated intellectual who reads Proust and Mann, and Manoly Lascaris, this cultured, cosmopolitan Greek man. And what are they doing? They're growing vegetables and breeding dogs.
Pedigree schnauzers, to be exact. They also sold milk and cream and flowers. They were working the land.
Imagine buying a Schnauzer puppy in, say, 1950, and having no idea that the breeder is in his spare room at night writing the great Australian novel.
It's an incredible juxtaposition. But for White, it was an immense struggle. He was working the farm all day and trying to write at night, exhausted. And initially, the reception for his work in his home country was, well, it was cold.
His book, The Ant Story, came out around this time.
It did. And this really establishes the pattern that defines the first half of his career. The Ant Story was praised in the United States. The critic James Stern in the New York Times absolutely loved it, called it a work of genius.
And in Australia.
Crickets. It was largely ignored, or if it was reviewed, it was misunderstood.
Why the disconnect? Why did the Americans and the British get it when the Australians didn't?
I think the literary cultures in America and Britain were just more accustomed to modernism by that point. They were used to Virginia Woolf, to James Joyce, to Faulkner. Australian critics at the time were still very much wedded to the old bush ballad tradition, realistic, straightforward storytelling.
So White's style, the stream of consciousness, the shifting perspectives, this intense focus on the interior life of a lonely spinster.
It was just alien to the local critical establishment. They didn't have vocabulary to appreciate what he was doing.
He must have felt incredibly isolated. He's finally come home, and he's still an outsider.
He was. He wrote this heartbreaking line where he described himself as a despised colonial in England and an artist in horrified Australia. He felt he didn't fit in anywhere. And that isolation led to a real crisis. He seriously questioned whether he should even keep writing.
But then, something happened. Out there at Dogwoods. A moment in the mud.
1951. It had been raining for what felt like forever, a typical Sydney deluge. White was out on the farm, slipped and fell flat on his back in the thick, squelching mud. And he just lay there and started cursing.
Cursing God.
Cursing a God he was pretty sure didn't exist. He was an atheist at this point. But in the middle of this rage, this torrent of curses, he had a kind of epiphany.
What was the realization?
He realized that his own personal scheme of things, his own intellectual arrogance, was just too foolish and small, that there had to be something more. It wasn't a sudden conversion to a specific doctrine, not at all, but it was an awakening to a spiritual dimension in life. It led him to believe in God in some form.
And that moment of spiritual crisis in the mud.
That moment inspired his next novel, The Tree of Man.
Which is a novel about an ordinary couple in the land, right?
Yeah.
Stan and Amy Parker.
Yes. He said he wanted to show every possible aspect of life. Birth, death, marriage, work, joy, suffering through the lives of these very ordinary, uneducated people. He wanted to show that even in a simple life of milking cows and clearing scrub, there are these moments of immense spiritual revelation.
But while he was finding God in the mud, he was also looking at the broader Australian society around him and seeing something he hated. This is where we get his famous concept of the great Australian emptiness.
This is one of the most famous and scathing cultural critiques in Australian history. White looked at the booming suburbia of 1950s Australia, the Menzies era, and he saw a spiritual vacuum, a void.
Let's unpack the quote, because it is absolutely brutal. He described it as a society where the mind is the least of possessions.
And where muscles prevail, it's so cutting. He talked about the buttocks of cars growing hourly glacier.
The buttocks of cars, that is such a specific, visceral, and kind of disgusting image.
It perfectly captures that obsession with shiny material surfaces. He said that for Australians, food just means cake and steak, and culture meant nothing. He was criticizing a culture that he felt valued materialism and physical prowess above everything else, above intellect, above art, and above the spirit.
It sounds like he was essentially calling the whole country a bunch of bogans.
In a way, yes. And look, there's definitely a strain of snobbery in it. We can't deny that. But I think it was deeper than just snobbery. I think he was genuinely anguished by it. He felt that the country had this incredible mystical landscape and this huge potential, but that the people were content with mediocrity. They were afraid of the deep dive, to borrow our phrase. They were afraid to look at their own souls.
So he writes The Tree of Man in 1955 and then Voss in 1957, really as a direct challenge to this emptiness.
Exactly. And the critical divide just widens into a chasm. Overseas, The Tree of Man is hailed as a masterpiece. It gets compared to Tolstoy. But in Australia,
the poet A.D. Hope, who was a major gatekeeper of literary taste at the time, writes a review that has now become infamous.
He called White's prose pretentious and illiterate verbal sludge.
Illiterate verbal sludge. I mean, you can't get much more insulting than that. He's not just saying it's bad, he's saying the man can't even write a proper sentence.
No. And Hope genuinely believed it. He hated the style.
Right.
White didn't always use standard grammar. He'd break sentences into fragments. He'd use adjectives as nouns. He was pushing language to its absolute breaking point to try and describe things that are hard to describe, these mystical inner states.
But to a traditionalist like Hope, it just looked like a mess, like bad writing.
Exactly. It was a clash of two completely different ideas about what a novel should be.
And what about Voss? That's the big one, the one about the explorer, right?
Yeah.
Loosely based on Ludwig Leichhardt?
Very loosely, yes. It's about a megalomaniacal German explorer who leads an expedition into the heart of the Australian desert. But it's not really an adventure story in the traditional sense. It's a story about a man trying to conquer his own pride, his own ego. The desert is a metaphor for the soul. It's a metaphysical journey.
And eventually, slowly, the tide starts to turn in Australia, too.
It does. It had to. His next novel, Riders in the Chariot, in 1961, was the real turning point. It was so powerful, so undeniable, that it finally won over most of the local critics. He started winning the Miles Franklin Award, which is Australia's top literary prize. He won it twice, actually.
And then he famously refused to be considered for it anymore.
That's right. After his second win, he wrote to the committee and asked them to remove his books from consideration. He told them to give the prize to younger, emerging writers who needed the recognition and the money more than he did.
Which is a nice counterpoint to his reputation for being an arrogant curmudgeon.
It shows the complexity, doesn't it? He could be incredibly generous, but he did it on his own terms.
Okay, let's fast forward to 1973. The big one. The phone call from Stockholm. The Nobel Prize.
The absolute pinnacle of literary achievement. And the citation from the Swedish Academy is so important here. They awarded it to him for his epic and psychological narrative art, which has introduced a new continent into literature.
Introduced a new continent.
Oh.
That is a huge claim.
It's immense. It's an acknowledgement that before Patrick White, Australia wasn't really on the map of world literature in a serious, modernist way. He put it there.
So, pop the champagne, right? National hero status, parades down the street.
Hardly. White's reaction was classic Patrick White. He was horrified. He didn't want it. He gave an interview where he said, the machinery behind it seems a bit dirty. He felt that suddenly becoming this global celebrity, this public figure, would completely destroy his privacy and his ability to work.
And this is where we get that quote from the start. He called it a terrifying and destructive experience.
Terrifying and destructive. And he meant it. He refused to for the ceremony in Sweden.
Can you imagine? The King of Sweden is waiting to hand you the medal and you just send your mate instead.
That's exactly what he did. He sent his friend, the painter Sidney Nolan, to collect it for him. It was a massive snub to all the pomp and circumstance that he despised.
And this is a really key. But he didn't just pocket the prize money.
No. He used the entire sum to establish the Patrick White Award.
And the criteria for that award is very specific and very revealing.
It is. It's specifically for Australian writers who have made a significant and ongoing contribution to literature, but who haven't received adequate recognition. In other words, he wanted to help the outsiders, the ones who were struggling for recognition just like he had struggled for those first 20 years.
That brings us to the next and maybe most surprising phase of his life. Because after the Nobel, he doesn't just retire to his garden. He becomes loud.
He becomes the activist. And this is a genuine shock to people who only knew him as the conservative grazier's son who had voted for the Liberal Party, which is the conservative party in Australia, for years and years.
What changed? What was the catalyst?
I think the 1960s changed him, as it changed so many people. He saw the world shifting. But for White, it was a radical shift to the left. He became a fierce opponent of the Vietnam War.
And not just in a signing petitions kind of way.
No, not at all. He got up on stage at rallies and illegally incited young men not to register for the draft. That was a serious crime. He was putting his freedom and his reputation on the line.
He also got heavily involved in environmentalism, which was quite ahead of its time.
He did. He fought against a proposal to build an Olympic stadium in Centennial Park in Sydney. He fought against sand mining on Fraser Island. He saw the great Australian emptiness as not just spiritual, but also physical. This willingness to destroy natural beauty for profit.
But the big political turning point, the moment of no return, seems to be 1975, the dismissal of the Whitlam government.
This was the moment that turned him into a fervent Republican. When the Governor-General, Sir John Kerr, who is the Queen's representative, dismissed the democratically elected Prime Minister Gough Whitlam, White was absolutely apoplectic.
He saw it as a profound betrayal of Australian democracy.
He did. He saw it as a colonial relic, the Crown interfering in a sovereign nation. In protest, he returned his Order of Australia, the highest civil honor, and he spent the rest of his life arguing passionately for an Australian republic.
And then there was the issue of nuclear disarmament.
He called it the most important moral issue in history. By the 1980s, he was a regular fixture at protest marches. You have to picture this. This elderly, frail, Nobel Prize-winning intellectual who was notoriously private, marching in the streets with the punks and the unionists and the hippies all chanting against the bomb. It's an amazing image.
But while he was fighting all these external battles, he was also dealing with some very intense internal conflicts, which he then made public. In 1981, he published his memoir, Flaws in the Glass.
This book was a bombshell for two main reasons. First, he came out publicly as homosexual. Now, everyone in his artistic circle knew, of course, but this was a formal public declaration to the entire nation at a time when that was still a very brave thing to do.
And the second reason?
The burning of the bridges. The book contained absolutely scathing portraits of many of his former friends. He was vicious about people he felt had let him down. He insulted Sidney Nolan, the man who collected his Nobel Prize for him. He insulted the opera singer Joan Sutherland.
Why? Why torch those lifelong friendships so publicly?
White valued truth above all else, or at least his version of the truth. He felt Nolan had sold out, that he'd become too commercial, too cozy with the establishment. White had this incredibly puritanical streak, and if he felt you had compromised your artistic integrity, you were dead to him. Simple as that.
Nolan considered suing him, right?
He did. The friendship ended instantly and irrevocably. It really shows that White was not an easy man. He was prickly, unforgiving, and held people and himself to impossibly high standards.
Speaking of burning things, he also famously burnt his own work.
Yes, this is another key part of his controlling nature. Before moving houses, and then again later in life, he built a bonfire and burnt most of his private papers, manuscripts, letters, journals. He wanted to control his legacy completely. He didn't want academics and biographers picking through his unfinished drafts and his private thoughts. He wanted the finished work to stand alone.
Let's pivot then to the themes of that work. We've mentioned the great Australian emptiness, but what is the core philosophy that's really driving his novels?
I'd say at the center of almost all his books is the search for reality. But not social reality, not who is marrying whom or who's making money. He was interested in a higher reality, a spiritual or metaphysical reality.
The truth behind the curtain.
Exactly. His characters are almost always trying to grasp a truth that lies just behind the veil of ordinary, everyday life. And crucially, the people who are most likely to see this truth are the outsiders.
The explorers, the artists, like in Voss.
Yes, but also the simple-minded, as he would have called them. In his novel, The Solid Mandala, one of the main characters is a brother who is intellectually disabled, yet he is the one who has the true spiritual connection to the world. White believed that those on the margins of society, the outcasts, the failures, the mad, often saw more clearly than the successful, conformist pillars of the community.
And where did his own spirituality fit into all this? You mentioned he wasn't a standard Christian.
Not at all. He once described himself brilliantly as a lapsed Anglican, egotist, agnostic, pantheist occultist.
That is a mouthful. Let's break that down.
It basically means he picked and chose what he needed. He believed in a god, but not the one from the prayer book. He was deeply influenced by Jungian psychology. He dabbled in the tarot and other forms of mysticism, and the pantheist part is key. He believed the divine was present in everything, in a rock, in a gob of spit, in a twisted tree. God wasn't in a church. God was in the mud.
In his later career, he really started to push the boundaries of identity in ways that feel incredibly modern.
The Twyborn Affair from 1979 is a prime example. It explores gender fluidity in a way that was decades ahead of its time. The protagonist lives as a woman, then as a man in the trenches of World War I, then as a woman again running a brothel. White was exploring this radical idea that the soul has no fixed gender.
And his final novel, Memoirs of Many in One.
A bawdy, wild, hilarious, and terrifying book about senility and the disintegration of the self. He was writing about the mind falling apart as he himself was facing his own physical decline.
He really did not mellow with age, did he?
Not one bit. In 1988, for the bicentenary of British settlement in Australia, the whole country was throwing this massive year-long party. White refused to publish anything that year. He issued a statement saying, "Circuses don't solve serious problems." He thought the celebration was a dishonest spectacle that was ignoring the plight of Indigenous Australians and the country's unresolved, bloody history.
Let's talk about the end. He died in 1990.
He did. He died at home in his house in Centennial Park. He'd been suffering for years from osteoporosis and glaucoma. He was in a lot of pain.
And his legacy. Is there a Patrick White museum, a writer's house you can tour?
No, and that's absolutely by his design. His house is privately owned. There's no institute, no foundation bearing his name, apart from the award. In a way, he has vanished back into the landscape just like his character Voss did, but his influence is undeniable. Every serious Australian novelist writing today, people like Peter Carey, Tim Winton, Richard Flanagan, they are all, in one way or another, writing in the space that Patrick White cleared for them.
So this is where it gets really interesting for me. We have this man who spent his whole life attacking his country. He called its people materialistic, its culture empty, its suburbs ugly. He insulted its heroes, and yet he is its most decorated and revered writer.
It raises the fundamental question. Was his difficult nature, his constant criticism, actually the ultimate form of patriotism?
How so? Explain that.
Well, think about it. If you don't care about a place, you just ignore it. You leave. You don't spend 50 years of your life screaming at it to be better. White attacked the great Australian emptiness because he desperately wanted to fill it. He wanted Australia to have a soul. He forced a young, insecure, sunburnt culture to look in the mirror and see not just the cheerful surface, but the darkness and the divinity underneath.
So by being un-Australian, in the way that term is often used, meaning, not being a cheerful, easygoing mate, he was actually doing the most patriotic thing he could have done.
I think so. I think he loved the country enough to tell it the hard truths, even if it made everyone, including himself, miserable.
That is a powerful and very provocative thought to end on. Patrick White, the man who hated the buttocks of cars, but loved the mystical light on the gum trees.
A complex man for a complex continent. You couldn't have one without the other.
Thanks for listening to this deep dive. If you've never picked up a Patrick White novel, maybe start with Voss or The Tree of Man. It might be a challenge, it might feel like verbal sludge at first, but hey, muscle shouldn't prevail over the mind, right?
Absolutely. Give it a try.
See you next time.